Well, last video we looked at John Calvin, his deep theological treatise, and his founding in Geneva, Switzerland, of the first and only Christian police state. And before that, we looked at Germany, and we saw Luther and his obsession with faith alone.
And now for something completely different.
Now we're going to look at merry old England, a place where Reformation was by lust alone. Hi, welcome to the Catholic Skeptic. My name's Hugh. Glad you could join us today. We're going to continue with our series on Protestant history. It's been interesting as we've been doing this and looking at the comments coming in. One thing I wanted to say before we start with this one, this is not about bashing. I know some of these guys, it's a slam fest against Calvin, or a slam fest against Luther. Not at all. I'm pointing out very basic historical realities. One gentleman who comments fairly regularly had made the point about, well, what are all the popes? And the popes have done things. Look, we all know that the popes were mingling in politics. There was the famous Pope Boniface, two swords, the sword of the church, and then the sword of actual armies to do things. We know about the papal states that existed right up until Mussolini made I think it was called the Lateran Treaty in the early 20th century to confine the church's political power to a sovereign state of the Vatican City, which is only 108 acres, plus some other properties like St. John Lateran and other places in Rome. And popes have been involved with politics, and there have been corrupt popes. We know there are popes in the Borgia families, popes in the Medici family. There's all kinds of things that have gone on. And we are going to actually get into some of that stuff in some future videos to explain it all. But we're not talking here about things that went awry later on. We're talking about origins. Again, remember I gave you that quote from the historian Hilaire Belloc, all things to their origins. Let's go back to the origins of things. And we're looking at the origin of things happening. And the point is not to be necessarily sensational, but to try and show some of these original bases. Now, we looked again at Luther. We looked at faith alone. We looked at his doctrine. We saw John Calvin, again, a magnificent theologian, the Institutes of the Christian Religion alone, which I showed you the book in the last video. Amazing document. I disagree with his conclusions and his views, but he wrote deeply theologically. Certainly, he had a deeper knowledge of the Bible than Luther did. But we also saw that he founded what was essentially the one and only Christian police state. Yes, he did. He governed that way. He governed with iron hand. He used magistrates. That was foundational. Now we're going to look at England. And what's amazing about England is it is a not salvation, but reformation by lust alone. See, in England at this time, there was no Reformation movement happening. And the man of the hour, Henry VIII, King of England, beginning in 1509, Henry VIII was an amazing individual when he began. He's very literate, very bright, very intellectual, and he was also a devout Catholic. Yes, Henry VIII loved being Catholic. He went to 3 masses a day, daily mass, but 3 of them a day. My parish has 3 masses a day, but due to my job, I can't attend any of the daily masses. But he was a daily mass guy, but 3 a day. He wrote a book on the 7 sacraments, defending them against Luther and condemning Luther's teachings, as that had been happening in history when he wrote that. And Pope, it was Leo X, gave him the title Defender of the Faith. This is how serious Henry VIII was as a Catholic. There was nothing in his nature or his study or anything else that would have caused him to want to embrace Protestant notions of theology and Protestant notions of reform or anything else. He was not like that. He was very content being Catholic. And all of England, for the most part, was too. I'm sure there were individuals in there, and some of the people that Henry surrounded himself with, we'll find out a little about them. But there wasn't a Reformation movement of that nature necessarily in England like it was in other places. Germany pretty much became divided between Catholic and Protestant. France had major divisions between it. And of course, that's why Calvin went to Switzerland, and the city of Geneva was very decidedly Protestant, but in its outlook. But there was not that movement in England, and Henry was not, by his own definition, somebody who would have pursued that. All right, he was very, very, very uber Catholic in his outlook. Now, again, when you see paintings of Henry VIII, you see younger ones, he was slim, trim, athletic. He was robust. He was intellectual. That in later years, he became, more accustomed to eating too much and drinking too much, and got so heavy that he had to be physically moved around. There were changes in his life. But one of the major things that affected Henry, now we know, of course, he was married. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, his real wife, Catherine of Aragon. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Yes, the same ones who helped finance Christopher Columbus. Those were her parents. It was obviously an arranged marriage. There was political expedience in that kind of a union. But on the other hand, she was a faithful wife, very devout Catholic herself. She had 6 children, 5 of whom died and didn't make. I don't know if they came to term and that. Only 1 survived. But the whole issue that began to change was Henry became infatuated with a lady by the name of Anne Boleyn. All right. Very infatuated, obsessed with Anne Boleyn. Anne was someone he was attracted to. Now, Anne was mocked by the English people and amongst the, various groups, and she was nicknamed the googly-eyed whore. But Anne was not wanting to be the mistress of Henry. She wanted to be his wife, and he was obsessed with her, and that began to cloud his judgment severely. That became his main cause and goal in life. He had a man named Cardinal Wolsey who was, who served in his court, and he tried to use Cardinal Wolsey as an opportunity to find a way to end his marriage so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. The argument kind of was that because Catherine of Aragon was betrothed and in fact married briefly in an official capacity to someone who. A marriage that was not very consummated and was therefore annulled by the church, because you understand in the Catholic Church, a real marriage is considered indissoluble, but annulments do happen if it can be determined that there was never any real marriage. And all the evidence and all historical documentation suggests there was no evidence that there was any issue with her. She certainly was not unfaithful to the king or didn't do anything of that. There were some accusations made by Henry. No evidence of that whatsoever. But of course, Wolsey failed. He couldn't obtain the divorce. He was ousted. But these were the motivations that were driving Henry. All right. Now, what happened with Henry is he began to surround himself with a certain circle of friends. Winston Churchill, I believe, in his book History of the English-Speaking People, called them like low-minded men, and a certain inner circle that was their own kind of group. And the 2 most prominent ones were a man named Thomas Cranmer. And another one, Thomas Cromwell. Now, Thomas Cranmer was a priest who had violated his vow of celibacy, gotten himself married. Now, again, this is not about, the Protestants always take, Catholics are celibacy. It's not about whether priests should or shouldn't be celibate. It's about the fact that if you take a vow before God, do you keep that vow? Should I keep my marriage vows or should I blow them off? I believe I should keep them, all right? I love my wife, but, marriage, you stay faithful. And if you took vows as a priest, you stay faithful. Cranmer didn't. Thomas Cranmer was kind of he's referred to as the trimmer in history. He would trim doctrine. He would cultivate a sort of a Protestant ideal, but he wasn't real with any strong conviction. He was kind of very wishy-washy in his approach. Thomas Cromwell had been elevated to be the king's secretary, and yes, he is related to the famous Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell was the uncle of Oliver Cromwell. Now, Oliver Cromwell, as you may or may not know, of course, was the leader of the big rebellion in the English Civil War that overthrew the monarchy. And for a time, Oliver Cromwell was the Lord Protector of England. Oliver Cromwell was a passionate man of faith, a very staunch Protestant Puritan with very strong Puritan views, and enforced those all over England decades later when after the English Civil War took place. Thomas Cromwell was not. Thomas Cromwell worshipped money and power. Those were his main things, money and power. He saw the role of enriching the state, the English state in every way possible, and the monarchy in any way possible, and consolidating power is the big issue. All right. Anne Boleyn had given Henry, back to her, a book. I'm going to get the title right. He gave her a book by William Tyndale. Title was On the Obedience of the Christian Man and How Christian Rulers Ought to Govern. Now, William Tyndale, of course, a man that Henry later hated because he opposed his idea of getting a divorce as well as what the Catholic Church did. But Tyndale is known for, of course, his Bible translation. But Tyndale was also a very strong advocate of a doctrine that was formulating in Protestantism right from the beginning. It was Luther's notions of involvement with the German princes were part of that. John Calvin's rule in Geneva was to do with the fact of bringing the state into full concord and power, that the state should be supreme over the church, that the rulers and kings should be the ones in charge of the church. Again, some of the commentators, God bless you, the Protestant ones, you guys get all huffed up about this. Oh, popes and politics. It's not about this. It's not just about popes involved with politics or trying to regulate state people. This is the idea of the state regulating the church. When you talk about the concept of the separation of church and state, for example, the American notion based on a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote, not actually a term in the Constitution, but there was as much a concern for protecting the church from the state as the state from the church. Later generations of reformers, such as the Anabaptists, the precursors of Baptists, many of them were persecuted by the Protestants as well as by the Catholics, but strongly by the Protestants, because they opposed church involvement with the state. They saw the church, even as their Protestant understanding, as a separate thing. But Tyndale's view he cultivated this idea of the state church. So this was a big concern. Now, Thomas Cromwell was passionately into the idea of this, not for any theological reasons. He was a very secular guy, didn't have any faith at all, as far as all the testimonies of various historical books testify. And by the way, I will make some references to where my sources were again at the end of this video. I think I did that a little bit last video on my memory, if serves, but definitely because I was he's not using any sources. And most of the guys who cry, you're not using any sources, don't care what the sources say anyway, because you just don't believe it, no matter what we say. But I will point out some sources. But Thomas Cromwell was known to be a guy who was very secular, very orientated toward the world and power. He wanted to consolidate power. So naturally, he egged on Henry on this idea of getting a divorce, of somehow or an annulment achieved, and was actually probably more hopeful that it would fail, which it did, which caused the split with the Church of England. All right, and the arguments that were used theologically that Thomas Cranmer helped again with, because Thomas Cranmer basically wanted to point the church in the direction of the Protestantism, but didn't have a real strong handle on it. And Henry still maintained a lot of his so-called Catholic faith and practice in his life, in spite of this wicked desire to go after Anne Boleyn and forsake his own wife. But so that was still happening. So when England broke with Rome because of the refusal to annul the marriage, Henry proclaimed himself the supreme head in 1534, the supreme head of the Church in England. All right, now it wouldn't be referred to as the Church of England until a later generation, but the Church in England, he was the head. And this wasn't just a wild idea. This was an idea that was being argued theologically to some degree in Calvin's writings, to some degree in Luther's writings, and in Tyndale's writings as well. This idea of the king in charge. Many times they would just simply take the arguments about how God, the divine right of kings, in other words, was a major theological point to these guys. All right, the desire to have rule over the church by the king. So when England broke with Rome, this was the emphasis. But this was the primary emphasis. Henry, theologically, kept Latin Mass. Priests maintained celibacy in spite of the fact of the hypocrisy of Thomas Cromwell, being a guy who broke his vows and married and still tight with Henry. He maintained priestly celibacy. He maintained many of the theological doctrines that were just the way they were, the devotionals, the practices, prayer to saints, all of those things, candles, stained glass, statues. Henry didn't change a lot of those things. All right. He maintained a very Catholic church in England that he himself was the head of. All right. Now he did, with the incitement and encouragement of Thomas Cromwell, do something else that is sometimes I remember both in college and even in high school, it's noted in the history books so lightly. Again, this is why I say public education in America, for example. I don't know how it is in some of the other countries that you all are from, but public education is notorious for soundbite education. You just get little, maybe you call them verbal written print bites or whatever, because it's in books, not sound, but statements in. And there's often a reference to Henry VIII suppressing the monasteries. I remember even reading that as a kid. What does that mean, suppressing? Henry VIII, with the Alvaramo, decided to shut down all the monasteries and all the convents in England, all of them. All right. and demand that the monks in there swear allegiance to him. Some of the first few monks who didn't were under Cromwell's orders disemboweled. Cromwell had set up networks of spies throughout there, and basically a suppression of free speech occurred big time to produce loyalty. But for the most part, most of the monks and nuns were simply made homeless. Get out and get a real job. They took the property. Now, Tyndale, of course, had advocated that property be taken from the church in order to spread to the poor. Was that their decision? No. Cromwell and Henry together spread the wealth, so to speak, amongst the cronies, amongst the gentry, amongst the landed class anyway. The landed class became more landed, more property, more buildings. And understand, these monasteries and convents were not simply the houses where the monks and nuns lived. These were also hospitals at times, and schools, and various charitable groups and things like that. All over England, just decimated. The monks were decimated and homeless. The buildings were turned into lavish estates, added to the property of all these various things. A whole extra wealth class was essentially, they were already wealthy, but they were enhanced to a higher level. So you had not only the lords and ladies of the court, but you also had the gentry. These were also known as the gentry, filled with wealth. This is what was going on. This is what the early church in England, with King Henry VIII as the head, looked like. He proclaimed what's called the Erastian state. All right, the word Erastian is a fancy word that refers to the idea of state power over the church, and that's the principle there. It's not churches mingling with politics. It's not interference. It's the state controlling the church, being the voice of authority within the church. And so you saw this kind of intense thing take place. All right, and Cromwell pushed this stuff big and strong and hard to be done. So again, you engorge these people financially all over the place. All right, but yet still, like I said, priests doing masses, hearing confessions, real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Henry was dogged on maintaining that doctrine in spite of his hypocrisy in his lifestyle. All of that was there. Now, Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell had two counterparts, so to speak, and that's Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher. All right, Bishop John Fisher was a clergyman who was very adamantly Catholic and very, very faithful to being Catholic, and again, Henry tried to get him to submit to Henry as the head of the Church of England. Thomas More was his friend. Thomas More was a brilliant intellectual, attorney, family man, loved God, loved his family, very literate, very intellectual. He hung with people like Erasmus of Rotterdam and others, intellectual class of the day, Catholic intellectual class of the day. He was known to be a man who wore, for example, in the case of Thomas More, lavish clothes, but he would wear a hair shirt underneath. Now, that's a way a hair shirt was a rough, coarse, uncomfortable shirt that you wore as a penance, kind of, as something to remind you of your humility and your dependence on God. It would be painful and itchy and uncomfortable to keep your mind off not being too caught up in your wealth. That was just a practice that went on, a tradition of man, and not even a tradition of the church, a sacred tradition or a dogma. Relaxed Protestants, but just a practice was going on. But it demonstrated More's holiness and his purity of this. So Thomas More, of course, would not only not submit, he stayed silent. He just got quiet. He wouldn't take an oath of allegiance to the king's head of the church. He refused to attend Henry's wedding to Anne Boleyn, which Anne Boleyn was pregnant, by the way, already at that wedding. He wouldn't participate until eventually, as was Bishop John Fisher. Now, the Pope Paul III, I believe, was by this time, he decided to elevate Bishop John Fisher to the rank of cardinal. That incensed Henry, and so Henry had Bishop John Fisher executed. All right. Thomas More, you have to understand, was Henry's friend. They hung out together. As young men, they were friends together. When he was king, they would have dinner together, and Henry would go to the house of his family, and he would come to the court of the king. They were close friends and comrades. Thomas More was like his rank was chancellor, and I think he was I can't pronounce that word. It's a proper word in English for office in the church. But he was also essentially like a district attorney. He prosecuted cases. He acted on behalf of the state for things like that. This was his job. But he tried his best to stay silent, but when pressed to it, he told the king, no, you're not the head of the church. Jesus Christ is the head of the church. Okay, Protestants think we don't believe that. Yes, yeah, Jesus Christ head of the church, and the authority of the Pope stands. And no, we're not. I'm not going to submit to you as the head of the church. So initially, Henry, again at the bidding and Egon of Cromwell, this is about 2 weeks after Bishop Fisher was executed, sentenced him to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. So they said like the sentence that was given to William in the Braveheart movie, played by Mel Gibson. All right, but then he commuted the sentence down to just a beheading. So he was having one of his closest friends beheaded because he wouldn't submit to him as the church. And of course, Thomas More had the famous response to this, where he his last words for his execution, where he's, "I remain the king's good servant, but God's first." All right, the king's good servant, but God's servant first. And he was beheaded. Of course, both John Fisher and Thomas More are canonized saints in the Catholic Church. So for us, it is Saint Thomas More and Saint John Fisher. But these men were more prominent, more connected, they had more to lose besides their lives than did guys like initially Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer. But this is what was going on during that time. All right, this is what was happening. So for Henry, the English Church still remained fairly Catholic. But when Henry died, things changed a little bit. Henry's son Edward became king. Edward was an 8-year-old boy when he grown very sickly, didn't last or live that many years, only a few years. But Thomas Cranmer, Father Cranmer, got a hold of Henry, and he began to emphasize more Reformation stuff. All right, it's not that, and I shouldn't say that isn't fair. More Reformation, but more of the intenser things that went on during the time of the Reformation. For example, he got, because he was a boy, he got him involved with. He saw Edward as the savior of the Protestant cause. So with him, there were outbursts of smashed altars, abolished saints, whitewashed walls, coverings, religious murals were covered up, prescribed rites, forbidden ceremonies, denial of marriage as a sacrament, married priests were allowed, ecclesiastical sanction of divorce, a symbolic communion and a communion of bread and wine, no more of this real present stuff. Pope was proclaimed the true son of the devil, an antichrist, an abominable tyrant. So it became revved up much more intensely in England. What's interesting, though, is the English people were not into that. All right, there's a great knowledge of things called priest holes, where some of the more wealthy ones would have a secret underground hideout. An ordained Catholic priest would be smuggled in to come and say mass for them privately. This was referenced in one of the James Bond movies recently with Daniel Craig, where they were at his parents' estate after he was orphaned or whatever. He went back to the home where he stayed or whatever, and they had a priest hole in there. They referred to it as the priest hole, hiding in the priest hole. But there was a great desire to maintain. The English people didn't want these things. An excellent book authored by a man named Eamon Duffy. I don't know if I have it here. I think I do. I'll show it to you all. Called The Stripping of the Altars, Traditional Religion in England from 1400 to 1580. And it describes the rich Catholic tradition that was involved in England at the time and how much this was opposed. People did not want this, all right? They didn't want this to happen, all right? But of course, when Edward died, Mary Tudor came to the throne, all right? And of course, Mary Tudor, again, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, came into power. She is, of course, known by the famous tag Bloody Mary. Mary Tudor came in, Catholic fervently, and made a big triumphant entry to restore the faith and bring Rome and bring the Catholic Church into submission. She reversed all these things. She reversed all these measures, but unfortunately, she did so with a vengeance in her heart. All right, Bloody Mary. She over the course of her short reign, she put to death 300 Protestants as martyrs. Yes, the Catholic Queen. The Catholic Church. It wasn't the Catholic Church. It was Mary personally, and her vengeance, and her rule. So she put those to death, and this was her entire rule during this time. She remained in there from 1555 to 1558. She married Philip, another ruler of Spain. She helped formulate lots of arguments in favor of Protestantism because of the martyrs who did die there. Now, it's interesting. Among those martyrs, was Thomas Cromner. But Thomas Cromner was wishy-washy to the end, but repented. He confessed being Catholic before he was executed. Thomas Cromwell, all right, he who had no faith at all before going to the chopping block or the stake. I'm not sure whether, honestly, what most of the books that talk about their execution doesn't talk about how they died. He, of course, also declared his allegiance to the Catholic Church and recanted his support of Henry and Henry's divorce and everything else. Both these men, when faced with death, they all wanted to be in the grace of God that they saw in the Catholic Church, not in the Protestant Church. So that's a very interesting scenario. Of course, then came the daughter of Henry and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth. Now, Queen Elizabeth has been the subject of so many books, a couple of major films that starred, I believe, Cate Blanchett playing her. They're interesting films to watch. Elizabeth was kind of a bloody Elizabeth the other way. Elizabeth, she wanted to establish the Church of England in a very specific manner, but Elizabeth was what you might call the ultimate moderate. There are some people who joke about the concept of a moderate, as they say, if you're not on the, and again, this is more of a political analogy, but it applies spiritually here. If you're not on the right or the left, you're just in the middle of the road, you're just going to get run over. But Elizabeth established an intense moderateness. Elizabeth did not want any part, of course, of the Catholics. Hated the Catholic Church, wanted no part of Catholics. It was outlawed to be Catholic in England under Elizabeth's time. But she hated the Puritans, too. She hated the people who were the more fundamentalists, the more Puritan, the Protestants who had closer to what it would be an evangelical faith right now. For those of you who are watching me who are the born-again Christians, Elizabeth hated the born-again Christians as much as she hated the Catholics. And she went on her own rampage. Lots of people were put to death then as well. So but we don't have, again, a historical record of bloody Elizabeth like we have Bloody Mary. Again, we see this sort of lopsided view of history that in spite of the secular world kind of wanting to put down religion of any kind, there's always a greater hatred for the Catholic Church than Protestants. And so you see this sort of pattern emerge. You don't know, most people don't automatically know that about Elizabeth, but she practiced this kind of thing. She established things very strongly. She wanted to create some sort of a weirdly democratic dictatorship. She wanted to hold things along those lines. She made the Anglican Church popular. Of course, she outlawed something like devotion to Mary, but Elizabeth became the Virgin Queen. In fact, in the second movie on Elizabeth, they do have it where she's caked in the white makeup to look almost statuesque, like literally looking like a little bit like a statue. Devotion to her, and it was a very person-centered approach. Elizabeth did all sorts of things, but the church itself, Protestant but moderate Protestant, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, is not, in the Church of England even today, you'll hear terms tossed around about, high church or low church people. There are low church members of the Church of England who sometimes embrace more of an evangelical kind of perspective. High church ones prefer a greater liturgy, because essentially the Church of England, in some ways, sort of apes the Catholic Church. It tries to create a version of it sort of there, but not really. Not just cut off from the Pope's authority, but doctrinally sometimes wishy-washy, but very big on ceremony. But low church people prefer less ceremony and more of a scriptural content. And yes, there were some people who advocated the Reformation in the midst of that, especially after it was more established. The Church of England, of course, gave two of the most prominent figures in Protestant history, John Wesley and George Whitefield. The evangelist George Whitefield, who evangelized over England and came to the American colonies pre-Revolution. Very, very faithful to his faith man, a very, dedicated man, man of God, traveled around horseback. I think he died at the age of 58, but he was a fiery preacher. He's the man who Benjamin Franklin, in a revival meeting that he was conducting in the colonies, this is again decades before the Revolution, but Benjamin Franklin was so moved emotionally by it that he emptied out his entire purse, his entire money into the offering. And now Benjamin Franklin, of course, Benjamin Franklin was not a Christian. He was more of a deist. he had that sort of mindset. Jesus was just a good man and philosopher, and he believed there was a God and there would be some sort of judgment, and we had to conduct ourselves with proper conduct. And he wrote all kinds of books in his own autobiography, which is an interesting book. I encourage people to read it if you want to understand something about Benjamin Franklin. But yeah, he was very moved by the power of George Whitefield's preaching. John Wesley, of course, technically the founder of the Methodist Church. Methodism, again, was a tagline when he was at Oxford because he was so methodical. He and his brother and some of his friends had something called the Holy Club, and you know, many other boys would make fun of them and talk about their method. They'd make up little drinking songs about them and make fun of, you know, method alone will guide them all, Methodist they call, or whatever, just sayings like this. So, you know, but John Wesley, again, traveled like Whitefield in the American colonies as well. However, Wesley, unlike Whitefield, was an organizer, and he organized and set up churches and started them and got them going. Both these men were ordained as Church of England preachers, ministers, priests of the Church of England. So again, there were people who were, both of those men were kind of heroic figures to me when I was a Protestant pastor, and I bought the entire complete works of Wesley and read through many of his historical things. I have I still own the Journal of George Whitefield. Fascinating man. I very much respect these guys, and I think I bash all the Protestants. Not at all. These men were genuinely loved Jesus and genuinely believed their understanding of Christianity and put their whole heart and soul into it. But so there are good things that came out. There are good individuals who came out of the Church of England for sure, and good ministries that came out of there. But again, it's that weird reverse. It's not something that started out phenomenal and then got corrupt, but rather it was kind of corrupt from the beginning in terms of all the structure of what happened. And yet at the same time, later generations produced some very holy and powerful men. So again, it's the mystery of which is why I began this series referring to the ludicrous history of Protestantism is that Protestantism doesn't have any one straight flow. There's all these different components that are involved, and England was weird. It was very strange and bizarre in that regard because again, it was motivated by lust, by a man who lusted. Because we often think of and again, history when they go a little, some of the college history books will go a little farther. They'll always talk about Henry's desperate desire for a male heir, which he's getting married and then beheading wives and moving through wives like he was. There was a desire for a solid male heir to sit on the throne for sure. But Henry's initial infatuation with Anne Boleyn was just that, infatuation. You know, he would probably say he fell in love. You know, but it was motivated by that. But you know, and again, although again, Anne Boleyn, I want to be your wife, not your mistress, was pregnant when she got married to him. And again, you saw it's common in the 21st century. Yeah, it is. But in those days, when they took life, death, eternity far more seriously, a large population, it was very radical and very, very, very scandalous in those days for that to be the case. But this was Henry's motivation, and such those desires clouds one's judgment, messes with one's judgment and perspective. Because I said Henry did not have a motivation in him, from what we can determine from all of these various sources you look through. There was not a motivation in him to want to be Protestant or to embrace Protestant faith. There was no moment of, the just shall live by faith, like Luther says that he had, or Calvin's deep theological understanding of predestination and various elements of the theological direction of Protestant Christian faith. Henry wasn't motivated by that, and yet Henry was very intellectual, very well read, and I said, but he started out as a very staunch Catholic. At least superficially, he went through the practices and the motions. But Henry also had a reputation for being the kind of guy who he'd learn a lot and was learned enough to have conversations with people on these topics, but was never as in depth. So it could have something to do with that as well. But this is how the Reformation in England unfolded. All right, lots of interesting characters that were involved, which we're not going to get to in this video in detail. But all these various individuals that were part and parcel of this process, and many historians believe, including Hilaire Belloc, one of the individuals that, amongst my sources. Hilaire Belloc has a book called "The Characters of the Reformation." Hilaire Belloc believed very strongly that the presence of the Reformation in England is what caused Protestantism to spread, in spite of the fact that it wasn't motivated by a deep theological conviction as much as maybe Luther was or Calvin was. Reformation might not have gotten off the ground in divided Germany, divided France, back and forth in Geneva, and things like that. But because it took root in England, and there were many people who embraced the Reformation, raised up in England, such as Wesley and Whitefield as two of the more giant ones, but there were movements there. And so that's why England has produced famous preachers, and the various generations. But this is what was going on in this period of time. This is how England formed. The Reformation, rather, in England formed. All right. Again, by lust alone, essentially, the Reformation emerged. It was Henry's passionate desire to get what he wanted, and his ability as king to get what he wanted and to get people around him who would get him what he wanted, or if he turned on them. This was what you saw happening. These are very sad origins for something that one wants to embrace. And again, what I found most interesting too, in my own study, this is part of my own testimony coming out of evangelical Christianity and into the Catholic Church, is that I can believe something and see verses in Scripture and get fired up and say, yeah, that's it. But unless I can have that confirmed by a source outside myself, how do I know that's not just me? Because the distinctions are the case everywhere. I've sat with Christians multiple times over the years, especially when I was in ministry, passionately disagreeing with each other on issues to the point of just being fiery about it, and both having equal portions of Bible verses to argue their point. Again, if one believes that the Bible is the infallible Word of God, then one really needs to have to believe there's an infallible editor. That there has to be a source outside of the Bible that can confirm, again, which books belonged in there and how they should be interpreted. Again, 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 20 tells us that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Now, prophecy there is a Greek word that means utterance. No word of Scripture is of any private interpretation. It's not privately interpreted. It's not supposed to be privately interpreted. Yet private interpretation is a hallmark of Protestant understanding so often. But to have so many different interpretations of the same statements, so many different ways, every which way but loose, all the time, it produces a madness and a chaos. And some of the Protestant commentators, you guys write in here, like, well, in the Spirit, you just know, Yeah, I'm fully familiar with what it means to feel like the Spirit bears witness with my spirit. I know this is true. And to be standing next to somebody who the Spirit bears witness with their spirit, the opposite is true. Continuously, back and forth. And the Bible, again, the major doctrines that Christians agree on, there are some. I mean, that the genuinely passionate Christians, Catholic and Protestant Orthodox, all agree on, like the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of the deity of Jesus Christ, that he was truly God and truly man, that he was born of a virgin, that he died on the cross, that he rose from the dead, truly alive, as a historical fact in his life. Those doctrines were strongly established and put in place before the New Testament canon was established by the church. Which church? The Catholic Church. Oh, that wasn't the Catholic Church. That was just the early Christians. They weren't getting together and voting, and they weren't busting out their King James and studying through them. All right, there was nothing like that. There were scrolls and circulating letters available. There were debates as to which books belonged there. Many rejected the Gospel, and many rejected the Book of Revelation, the Gospel of John, the Book of Hebrews. I've shared with you Luther himself seriously questioned, of course, called the Epistle of James, the Epistle of Straw. He called Book of Hebrews that were not reliable. Lots of books that were struggling with on that, and to have such a flimsy faith based on my private interpretation. And then you switch to Calvin, who decided his interpretation needed to be the interpretation law of the land in Geneva, and it became the enforcement to try and have a established counter church to the Catholic Church based on his men, his priests, his pastors, rather, his ordained men in Geneva, they were the interpreters. You had to go by their interpretation. And I've met pastors and preachers like that who say, well, if you're not really called to the ministry, then you don't have that special anointing to understand these things. Sounds just like the indicatives of attacks against the Catholic Church for not letting you have the Bibles and chaining up the Bibles, and really they were chained to the pulpit because there was no printing press. It was hard to get copies, but nevertheless, and we have a video called Protestant Lives of History where you can understand some of these things about banning the Bible and understand how distorted those ideas are historically, again, with textbook sound bites rather than really looking into the events and what really happened. But I encourage you to search it out. Again, this program I call The Catholic Skeptic. I'm trying to encourage skeptical thinking. That's more my goal here, to get you to think outside of the standard mindset. So, and look deeper into your faith. For Catholics, look deeper into your faith. For Protestants, question some of these things you just assume and accept. All right. Now, again, source-wise, Will Durant, Volume 6, The Reformation. Durant was, from all I can gather from all I've read of him, and I've used his for years, he was kind of a humanist. He was as much anti-Catholic, anti-Protestant, more of a deistic, humanistic kind of thinker. But again, puts a lot of focus on the facts. The Stripping of the Altar. Altars by Eamon Duffy, very good book as far as understanding some of these fundamentals. Hilaire Belloc, yes, the Catholic historian, Characters of the Reformation, a great book. Harry W.S. I think his name is Harry, but H.W. Crocker III, his book Triumph on the History of the Catholic Church, excellent book. James Hitchcock has a very thick volume on the history of the Catholic Church, very excellent source material. For England, I also used Winston Churchill's History of the English-Speaking People, as well as a man by the name of Macaulay. Neither of these guys are Catholics, very Protestant. Much of our understanding of some of the stuff that went on in Henry's court comes from Churchill and Macaulay, who should be his allies, but who report historical facts. So there's a ton of historical information available out there. In fact, most of the stuff I'm doing in these videos is not deep history. This is basic history you can find if you want to research and look for it. All right. Not necessarily going to be in, like I said, typical high school or college textbooks, but it will be found if you're willing to do a little research and look a little deeper into it. So I encourage you always to do that and to look for that in your study. We'll be back with another video soon. Again, please hit like and subscribe. Keep the comments coming in, good, bad, ugly, doesn't matter to me. As I said, every time you write comments, you help grow the channel anyway, whether you like or hate me or like or hate what I stand for. But again, I don't see all the comments, so I can't respond to all of them. Someone just did a comment that as of the taping of this today, one of my pieces disappeared. He couldn't find a post, and I had responded to one of his questions. I'm not going to write it again, but I don't know why that happens. Sometimes things just get lost in the middle because there's just so many comments coming in. So it isn't possible to see all of them. I see what I can see and try to respond to them. If I've not responded to you, my apologies, but it's not possible just right now to respond to all of them. Again, I work a full-time job. It's not easy to be able to get that much time to do that, but I will try my best when I can. Pray for me. For my Catholic brothers and sisters who watch this, and subscribers, please pray for me. I'm praying for all of you, both generally as a group, all individuals, and certainly ones I write to, even ones when I go back and forth with, and we hash it out with the kind of Protestant Catholic debates in the comments. I'm praying for you guys too. I love all of you. Again, try to maintain that. Faith worketh by love. Whether we're opposed to each other or not, we should operate with love in our hearts toward one another. And so until next time, thanks for watching. God bless.